Castlevania, or Akamojo Dracula in Japan, released on the Famicom in 1986 and received wide critical acclaim. It went on to foster a massive fanbase and has spawned so many sequels I'm not even going to begin to list them all right now. Its legacy was even strong enough to get Simon and Richter into Smash Brothers. When that reveal dropped, it made me realize something though. I pretty much had no perspective on the series playing the games wise. I had beaten Aria of Sorrow and some of Circle of the Moon, but the games as a whole were pretty foreign to me outside of just being aware of them existing in a few videos I'd seen. So it was decided then and there I was gonna beat a bunch of Castlevania games due to an obsession I seem to have with gaining a broader perspective on video game series. So now we're here, and I'm gonna do a huge retrospective on as many Castlevania games as I can possibly play. Big note on can possibly play. I don't want to get to the end of this and have someone say, "Hey dummy, you didn't play Castlevania Harmony of Frozen Foods, which was only released for those fridges that have screens in them." This is gonna be long, painful, but insightful. So let's dive right into the bat-infested hellhole that is Castlevania on NES. Now, while it's an NES game and doesn't have that much of a plot to it, I still want to go over this aspect since I'm going to do it for every other game in the series, and it'll get more involved as we go on. So, NES Castlevania takes place in 1691, Transylvania. It's been 100 years since Christopher Belmont killed Dracula and returned peace to the land, but chaos is growing in the hearts of man, and a group of evil men decide it's about time to resurrect Dracula. Simon Belmont, descendant of Christopher Belmont, seeks to live up to his family name and slay Dracula, ending his reign of terror on the land. So not exactly complicated, but it gives context to your actions, which is good enough for NES. Dracula is evil, and you gotta whip him and all his minions to death. Simple and straightforward. Not all games need to have in-depth or long and elaborate plots. Sometimes just having a reason at all is enough. So that gets the plot out of the way, but what about the actual game itself? For an NES game, Castlevania has some real nice presentation, and it shows it right from the start. The title screen has this film reel-like border like it's supposed to be some old vampire movie, and the intro of Simon walking up to the front gate with the castle looming in the distance, while very simple, really sets the mood. You're going into that castle, and you aren't leaving until Dracula is dead. It's a pretty iconic moment in the series, and probably comes to mind for a lot of people when they think of this game. They even redid it in Super Castlevania 4, but that's a different game for a different time. Past the front gate and going into the actual game, the environments are pretty nice with lots of little flares and details spread about, like moss on stones or torn curtains hanging from the ceiling. For being a horror-themed game, it has a surprisingly bright color scheme with lots of blues, oranges, and various other complementing colors, presumably so Simon and all the enemies stand out. It also has this very video gamey charm where most of the platforms are all built out of identical stone blocks, presumably so that when you break them to find pork chops, things still stay looking natural. And yes, I said pork chops, not wall chicken. It clearly says right here in the manual they are pork chops. I mean, God! Am I the only one who even cares about this sort of thing? What am I doing with my life? Now, I want to make a big point of the enemies' designs. One of the series' biggest strong points is how memorable and fun the enemies are. If you're a fan of the series, you probably know exactly what I mean. Everything from how imposing the axe armor feels, from how goofy the skeletons are, is just a treat. It's probably why they've stayed mostly the same throughout the series' run. Almost all the enemies are based on mythology, folklore, and classic horror media, and they really managed to make them all feel stand out. I wouldn't say that the first game has what I'd call the best looks of these enemies, but it sets them up nicely for the later renditions. And come on, look at this guy. How could you not love that face? Look at him. He's throwing all he got dang bones at you. It's great. Now, it would be an outright crime if I went through all this and didn't mention the music. These tunes just get you in the mood to kick some vampiric keister, and fit the themes of the game so well. It's adventurous, bombastic, and harrowing at times. Just take a listen to a few of these. I'm not really too knowledgeable on music, so I can't go into too much of the technical aspect, but anyone who tells you Wicked Child isn't a bop or that Out of Time doesn't sound real cool is a bad person and you shouldn't associate with them. I will say, these aren't exactly my favorite takes on these tracks. Later games really improve them a lot and breathe a lot more life into them, but 8-bit stuff really still carries its own charm that can't be ignored. Of note though, is that the Japanese version, which was released only on the Famicom Disk System, has higher quality versions of the tracks, which I haven't listened to that much, but I'd say it's definitely worth looking up. Okay, so we've gotten the look and sounds of this game out of the way, but now it's time to move on to the most important part, the gameplay and design. The gameplay is composed of straightforward side-scrolling platforming through 6 different stages of Dracula's castle, each of which end with a boss fight. You can't just walk right up to Dracula's throne room though. The levels are filled with a variety of traps and enemies that Simon has to navigate his way around. Thankfully, he's pretty well equipped for the job. Your main form attacking is the legendary Vampire Killer Whip, which starts out as a somewhat short leather whip and can be upgraded twice to a longer Morning Star. While I'm not exactly sure about the logistics of a whip literally transforming from leather to metal, it seems to be pretty effective at killing all sorts of creatures, so who am I to question? The whip has a decent amount of range when fully upgraded, but it has its limits. You can't walk and strike at the same time. Not to mention it has slow wind-up, which leaves you vulnerable if you miss your target or do it at the wrong time. Luckily, you can compensate for this somewhat because you can whip while in the air, giving it some mobility. It's still somewhat risky due to your jump being very stiff. Speaking of your jump, you can't correct it in midair, so planning and timing your jumps appropriately is necessary for not getting thrashed around by enemies or just outright missing your landings. Aside from using your whip and jump to kill/avoid enemies, you can have one of 5 different sub-weapons. These consist of the dagger, which you throw in front of you in a straight line and is completely useless, you should avoid it unless you have no other weapon. The axe, which flings in an overhead arc and is good for enemies that are above you. The cross, which functions like a boomerang, which I don't think is what crosses are for. The holy water, which is tossed on the ground and produces a fire that can hit stun enemies and does damage over time. And the stopwatch, which freezes enemies in place for a moment. There are also upgrades in the form of these 2 and 3 markers, which let you throw more of your sub-weapon. In order to actually throw them though, you need to collect hearts, which essentially act as ammo. You get them by breaking candles or the occasional enemy drop. This does beg the question though of why Dracula has so many hearts around his castle, and how did he manage to stuff them inside of candles? Also, they aren't as notable, but sometimes you'll get a crucifix that wipes out all the enemies on the screen, and an invincibility potion that makes you immune to damage for a short amount of time. Now this is good and all, but these are just the basic mechanics of the game. The real meat and appeal of this game, and most of the series for that matter, is the implementation and execution of the mechanics and how they line up to make the game's design. I feel like the best place to start elaborating this is right from the start of the game. The first area is a straight shoot to the front door of the castle. There are no enemies or hazards, and candles are spread about the path. This gives you a chance to practice how your whip and jump function, discover you can break candles, get items from candles, learn that your whip is upgradable, and generally just grasp the game's concepts before being tossed into the thick of it. This idea of introducing concepts in safe environments so they can be learned by the player as opposed to just throwing them blind and defenseless into death's path is one of the most important parts of quality game design, and Castlevania uses it well. For example, the first time you ever encounter a bone-throwing skeleton, you get a moment to see how it behaves before you end up in full range of it. Another is that there are no enemies in this small part before these spike traps, so you have plenty of time to watch and learn the pattern. It's simple but effective and can be found in most quality games. The game also, as stated, makes great use of the mechanics, and the levels are appropriately designed around them. Since Simon is pretty darn slow and has a very stiff jump, there aren't many massive gaps to leap across in a precise manner or segments that require speed. The jump is made to be sort of a risk outside of the few 3 or 4 block wide gaps you have to leap across. It really makes the player consider what they're doing before they do it. Also, your whip, as stated before, has a slow wind up, so you can't just spam it like crazy to wipe out your enemies. Picking the time to swing and not to swing is a very important decision. On that note, decision making and strategy are actually part of what makes this game so intense and interesting to play. Going through a level and developing a plan of action around factors like when to jump, where to take risks, what sub-weapons to have for what parts, and whether or not to use those sub-weapons so you can save hearts for a later segment. This creates an engaging pattern where no matter how many times you die, you always add adds something to your index of knowledge, which leads to you getting better. The growth and overcoming of obstacles that start out as insurmountable and turn into easy things you breeze past is what I personally love about the classic Castlevania games. The learning process combined with the difficulty makes all your victories feel so rewarding. Though when I say difficulty, I mean it. Castlevania comes from a time where designing for consoles wasn't that common, and what experience was there wasn't for games that had starts and ends. Most developers were familiar with developing for the arcade scene, where games were designed to be really nail-bitingly hard so you'd pump more quarters into them. It also didn't help that video rental stores made it to where someone could rent a game, theoretically beat it in a weekend, and never actually buy a copy. Due to cartridge space limits, they couldn't just make longer games, so the next best thing was to make them so hard it'd take you a lot of time to get good enough to win. Luckily, Castlevania doesn't actually suffer from this too bad, and in some ways benefits. Without the difficulty, it would be a forgettable romp you'd go through in an hour or two, but thanks to it, it becomes an exciting ordeal. Not to mention that it keeps itself in check for the most part and doesn't get too bullshit. Finally managing to beat a level or even just a room that gave you trouble feels so rewarding, and beating the whole game had me feeling on top of the world. But there are some times where bullshit does begin to bleed in, and it goes from a nice challenge to an annoying slog. This room is a classic example. The combination of the confusing to follow Medusa heads and challenging to deal with axe armor give you almost no room to breathe, and it just feels cheap. There's little to no wiggle room. You either do this perfectly or die. The whole game is hard, but there's a room or two like this where it just really pushes it. Dracula himself also really gets at me too, because the fight is very long, he can easily kill you in 4 hits, he can teleport on top of you delivering cheap damage, and it feels a lot like it has less to do with skill and more with luck. Though, I think one of the most vital parts of this pertains directly to the North American NES release of Castlevania. You remember how earlier I mentioned that the Famicom Disk System version of the game has higher quality music? Well, that isn't all it had. It also had a save feature, which is completely absent from the NES version. That's right, if you want to beat Castlevania on actual hardware, you have to do it all in one sitting. There aren't even any passwords like what a lot of games did back then. You just have to get good enough to do it in one straight shot. I'm a pretty big advocate of playing games on their original hardware, but even I feel that might be a bit much to demand for such a hard game. Personally, I'd recommend playing this on something like Virtual Console or the NES Classic so you can have save state at the start of every level. But just keep yourself in check and don't use the save state outside of that. The challenge of the game is still one of the main driving forces behind why this game is so compelling, and cheesing your way through it is just a disservice to yourself. All in all, Castlevania for NES is challenging, rewarding, well-designed, but occasionally suffers from unfair spikes in difficulty. I'm honestly not much of a fan of NES games generally speaking, but this one really gripped me, and I think it might have become my favorite on the whole system. It's definitely worth a play and is a great start to a wonderful series that only gets better as it goes on. But with that out of the way, next time we'll be taking a look not at Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest, but at Vampire Killer, an odd conversion / sequel for the MSX, released only in Japan and Europe. Until then, stay out of trouble and keep your eyes out for vampires.